Yeah, good evening. Thanks so much for inviting me to Finsbury Park Mosque. It's been interesting because I've been doing this research now for around 18 years. So I started looking into Islamophobia prior to 9/11, and the Finsbury Park Mosque has been an interesting one because it seems to have always been in the news for maybe positive or negative reasons, and so it's kind of been there all the time in terms of my research. It was also interesting in the introduction that you mentioned the issue around kind of the listening event with Muslim women, because one of the things that's come through in my research I've been doing for nearly 2 decades now is that Muslim women are, if you are a visible Muslim woman, you're more likely to become a victim of it or experience Islamophobia than a Muslim man. And this has been something which has kind of been recurrent throughout. And so it's good to know that actually the mosque and others around it are actually beginning to take this seriously. And from my understanding is that it's really anomalous in this respect, because Islamophobia is the only hate crime where women are the majority victims as well. So all other forms of hate crime tends to be against male victims. It was interesting because the introduction touched upon some of the issues that I really wanted to kind of highlight, and I think that in setting the kind of context, I think that we in this kind of post-Brexit referendum era, one of the things we know is that to July 2017 this year, we know that we had the highest increase in racial and religiously motivated hate crime in British history. So this was up 23%. We know that since the Brexit referendum, that on the whole we've become less tolerant. We've become more kind of expressive of our intolerance. We've become more expressive of our hate. And I think it's quite interesting today that we see that Donald Trump has retweeted Britain First videos, and you get this kind of idea that actually sort of when somebody at that level is doing this and kind of endorsing that, then it becomes very, you can see this kind of notion of permission to hate actually seeping down to the grassroots level. And if the President of the United States of America is saying it's okay to believe and support Britain First, then how can you stop somebody on the street from doing the same? So you get this notion that permission to hate has become something which is kind of become embedded within us. If you look at figures on specifically on attacks against Muslims, in the post-London Bridge, kind of post-Manchester kind of attacks, Tal Mama says that there was a 5-fold increase in the number of attacks against Muslims, a number of hate crimes against Muslims at the street level, not online, but in the real world scenario. That 5-fold increase in terms of like what would normally be expected in terms of what would a normal week be. And then also you have this idea that, that sort of, you look at the Metropolitan Police figures, for example, you'll see that year upon year that those figures seems to be going up as well. Now there's an issue around like kind of more people reporting, more people being comfortable to report and record those. But actually, we have to also look at the picture as well, and is that, the kind of anecdotal evidence that we kind of access is that actually there are more Islamophobic hate crimes actually taking place. Now, in terms of this, it was interesting because earlier this week I was invited to the Metro Mayor, Andy Street, which is the Metro Mayor of the West Midlands region, and he held a mayoral faith summit on Monday evening, interestingly at the University of Birmingham. And one of the things that he had there was he had the Police Crime Commissioner, David Jameson, for the West Midlands there, and there was a whole session on hate crime, and he said he began his talk by saying that actually the most amount of hate crime is racially motivated. Now that's something that we've known for many years. If you can look historically, you can see that. He said that most amount of hate crime is racially motivated, but then he said the highest percent, the majority of victims are Muslim. Now this presents a very interesting dilemma, because if Muslims are the victims, then it shows that actually those hate crimes are being recorded incorrectly, because they should then be put under the religiously motivated, because there is always that kind of overlap and blurring between race and ethnicity and religion. But actually, if somebody who's actually overseeing this is stating that fact kind of publicly, it would suggest that the police are doing this wrong. So what we get there is we get just that tip of the iceberg. We know that the data that we have is probably the tip of the iceberg as well. It was only interesting because he then went on and said that there was no strategy to go forward in terms of tackling religiously motivated hate crime. But then he took this really interesting sort of approach and said that whilst talking about hate crime, faith communities needed to play their part in stopping terrorism. And it was really interesting because it's like, what for me this was something that I increasingly see is that whenever we talk about tackling Islamophobia, whenever we talk about tackling Islamophobic hate crime, we always seem to get into a debate about, well, we need to tackle extremism as well. And I have no problem in saying that, yes, we do need to tackle extremism. We do need to address some of these issues in society. We do need to kind of counter that kind of process of radicalisation, because we know that there's extremists of all types and all persuasions who actually want to commit, kind of perpetrate harm against, different parts of British society. But it was interesting for me that at a faith summit that we had a talk about hate crime, and at the end it was like faith communities need to actually to play their part in stopping terrorism. And I think that this is one of the interesting things for me in terms of this, and in terms of Islamophobic hate crime, because actually going back to the kind of the atrocities that were committed here at Finsbury Park Mosque, in the immediate aftermath, Theresa May said Islamophobia is a form of extremism. And it's like, maybe some of those who perpetrate Islamophobic hate crime are extremists, but from what we know from research is that the vast majority of people who commit hate crime are ordinary people. There's this notion of a mission offender. Somebody has it's their life goal to kind of whether you're a white supremacist, but that they're actually in a minority. And one of the interesting things to me is the way in which Islamophobia is always conflated with extremism, because actually if we spoke about it as being hate crime, we have legislation in place, we have policy in place, we have the structures within the police forces across the country that actually could record this quite simply. In the same way that a flag is added to anti-Semitic hate crime, you can add an Islamophobic hate crime as well. The Metropolitan Police do this. Interestingly, not all of the police forces do. And then it's interesting if you look at Birmingham, where I'm based, and in 2013 we had the murder of Mohammed Salim on the way back from evening prayers. And actually, when that was sort of the response to that from the government was to include that in the Extremism Task Force report, which was an investigation into the murder of Lee Rigby. And on the first page it says, that we must tackle Islamophobia because it's a form of extremism. And it's like, well, actually, is it a form of extremism or is it a form of hate crime? Because actually, hate, bigotry, discrimination is really what underpins Islamophobia. It's not a form of extremism, because if you look at what we're talking about here, if we go back to Baroness Saida Farsi, she said that Islamophobia was past the dinner table test. The expression of anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic, Islamophobic sentiment and attitudes is actually become normalised. It's become something that we accept as normal. And in my book, I've said it's not only past the dinner table test, but it's past the playground test, it's past the workplace test, the office test, so on and so on. Actually, it's become much more widely accepted in terms of being able to express this. And so I really struggle in terms of the way in which we we respond to this, because I think that what we get is politicians and policymakers constantly referring to Islamophobia as though it's different, as though it's distinct and different from other forms of hate. Yes, there are specific aspects to it. Yes, different groups are targeted. But actually, if we were to bring this into the mainstream of how we respond to hate crime per se, one, it would actually take away the exceptional status of this. And two, it would actually communicate to British society much more widely that this is an unfounded prejudice, this is unfounded bigotry, hatred, and so on, which most people in British society actually agree we don't need in society as it is today. And if you look at the kind of government's extremism definition, Islamophobia cannot fit within that. It just cannot fit within this. Can it fit within hate crime? Yes, it can. Can it fit within the hate crime strategy that the government has got? Yes, it can. Can it fit within the definitions of hate crime? Yes, it can. Can it fit within the extremism strategy? No. Can it fit with the definition? No. So why is it that there is this thing? And I think that there's two parts to it for me. The first is that it sends out a very misguided message about Islamophobia. And allow me to be crass with this. It's that the message that's sent out is that when Muslims stop blowing themselves up, Islamophobia will stop. And that actually is not the case. My research began prior to 9/11. I know that when there's no extremist activities, I know that when there's no terrorist atrocities, actually what we see is that Islamophobia still exists. It's still there. It still takes place. Ordinary Muslim women walking down the street who are wearing a hijab will be spat upon. Muslim women taking their kids to school will be spat upon and abused. That's what my research has shown. It's not necessarily linked to a terrorist atrocity, but what we do know is that when there is a terrorist atrocity, then it spikes, then it intensifies, it gets much higher. The second part for me is that why, you know, in terms of why politicians and policymakers keep talking about this within the context of extremism, is that it's like a pacifier. We all know that when we look at counter-terror legislation, counter-terror policies, counter-radicalisation, we know that on the whole, if you look back over the past 10 years, it's largely been targeted at Muslim communities. Yes, we are seeing a change now in terms of those from the far right that are being brought in to prevent, being brought into channel. Yes, we are seeing that. But one of the things that we know is that historically, is that the counter-terror legislation and policy approaches have been targeted at Muslims. And for me, this is a way of saying, you know, when the policymakers talk about this, they say, well, you know, actually we will introduce this in terms of like sort of extremism, talk about this in terms of extremism. So don't rock the boat, because when we introduce more stuff around extremism, we're also tackling Islamophobia. And yet historically what we've seen is that Islamophobia has not been tackled. Islamophobic hate crime has not been tackled by any of the counter-extremism legislation or policies that have been brought in. So for me, so just in wrapping up, I think what's really important is to be frank and open with these conversations, to have these conversations, which is fantastic, but to also start talking about Islamophobia as not being exceptional. Yes, it's akin to racism, it's akin to homophobia, it's akin to anti-Semitism, but there are also specific aspects of that, as in all of those discriminatory phenomena. But if we talk about it in the context of it being similar to other discriminatory phenomena, as other forms of hate, as other form of hate crimes in terms of its manifestation, then I think that what we're doing, if we can then bring this into much more into the mainstream, I think by bringing it into the mainstream, we talk about it as being less exceptional. It doesn't look as though it's Muslims asking for special favours. Actually, what it sounds like is we're talking about this is something that we already as a society agree we don't want in our society, something that we can tackle in terms of that. And I think that what we also know as well is that, we're never going to get rid of racism, we're never going to get rid of sexism, we're never going to get rid of homophobia or anti-Semitism, in the same way we're not going to get rid of, completely eradicate Islamophobia. But actually by bringing it in, we can see that we can make a change, we can make a positive difference, and we can make an impact in terms of that. And for me, that is the way forward. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Chris, for setting the scene for